Did you know that Russia just publicly accused two major world powers of actively sponsoring terrorism across Africa? And we're not talking about some small-time players here. We're talking about France, one of Europe's most influential nations, and Ukraine, a country currently fighting for its very survival. The accusation that Emmanuel Macron's France and the Ukrainian government are secretly funding, training and arming militant groups across the African continent to destabilise entire governments. If true, this would completely upend international relations as we know them. It would expose decades of hidden manipulation. And it would force the world to confront an uncomfortable reality. That terrorism in Africa might not just be a local problem, but a weapon wielded by powerful nations, fighting a shadow war for control of an entire continent. But here's where things get really interesting. Because in global politics, the loudest accusations often hide the deepest truths. And sometimes the accuser has just as much to gain from chaos as anyone else. So today we're going to peel back the layers of this explosive claim. We'll examine the evidence, follow the money and influence, and uncover what's really driving this war of narratives. Because whether Russia's accusations are true, false, or somewhere in between, one thing is absolutely certain. Africa has become the ultimate prize in a global power struggle that will shape the next century. The storm didn't arrive quietly. It came through official Russian diplomatic channels, amplified across state-controlled media, and repeated at international forums with calculated precision. Russian officials didn't whisper these allegations in backrooms. They shouted them from the rooftops. The claim was explosive and specific. France, under President Emmanuel Macron's leadership, has been covertly supporting armed terrorist groups operating across Africa's Sahel region, the vast belt of land stretching from Senegal in the west to Sudan in the east. According to Moscow, Paris wasn't just maintaining a military presence to fight terrorism. It was actively funding it, training it, and using it as a weapon to maintain control over former colonies that were slipping from its grasp. But France wasn't the only target. In a twist that caught many analysts off guard, Russia also pointed its finger at Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine, the same nation currently locked in a brutal war for survival against Russian invasion. Moscow claimed that Kiev had been providing weapons, intelligence and training to certain armed groups in Africa, all as part of a broader strategy to weaken Russian influence on the continent. Think about that for a moment. A country fighting a desperate war at home, supposedly finding time and resources to fuel conflicts thousands of miles away in Africa. On the surface, it sounds absurd, but as we'll see, there's more to this story than meets the eye. The reaction from Paris and Kiev was swift and fierce. France called the accusations dangerous propaganda and lies designed to undermine French credibility. Ukrainian officials went even further, describing the claims as completely fabricated and part of Russia's wider information warfare campaign. They argued that Moscow was simply trying to distract from its own aggressive actions, both in Europe and in Africa. But here's what makes this moment so dangerous. In many parts of Africa, these accusations didn't sound impossible. In fact, to millions of Africans who have lived through decades of foreign interference, broken promises, and endless conflict despite Western military presence, Russia's claims resonated deeply. For you see, trust in Western powers, especially France, has been eroding across the Sahel for years. And when trust is already broken, even unproven accusations can reshape entire relationships. To understand why Russia's accusations found such fertile ground, you need to understand France's complicated history in Africa. And when we say complicated, we're being generous. For over 6 decades following African independence, France maintained what many call a special relationship with its former colonies. This wasn't just diplomatic courtesy. France stationed thousands of troops across the Sahel under operations with names like Operation Barkhane and Operation Serval. On paper, these missions had one clear objective: defeat terrorist groups threatening regional stability. At their peak, France had approximately 5,100 troops deployed across Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mauritania. That's more soldiers than some small nations have in their entire military. The cost? Hundreds of millions of euros annually. The justification? Protecting African lives and preventing terrorist groups from establishing permanent bases. But here's the problem. Despite years of French military presence, the violence didn't stop. In fact, in many areas it got worse. Between 2015 and 2022, terrorist attacks across the Sahel actually increased by more than 300%. Civilian casualties mounted. Entire communities were displaced. and frustration with France's role grew into outright anger. People began asking uncomfortable questions. If France was really there to bring stability, why did insecurity keep spreading? If French troops were fighting terrorism, why were attacks becoming more frequent and more deadly? And perhaps most damning of all, whose interests was France really protecting? The answer, many Africans concluded, wasn't their safety. It was France's access to strategic resources. The Sahel sits on some of Africa's richest deposits of uranium, gold, and oil. Niger alone supplies about 15% of the uranium used in French nuclear power plants, a critical resource for a nation that generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear energy. Mali has significant gold reserves, Burkina Faso has growing mineral wealth, and France, despite granting independence decades ago, maintained economic agreements that many viewed as neo-colonial. This is why public protests erupted across the region. In Mali's capital, Bamako, crowds filled the streets carrying signs that read, "France out," and burning French flags. Similar demonstrations spread to Burkina Faso and Niger. What was once framed as partnership began to feel like occupation. And then came the turning point. Starting in 2020, a wave of military takeovers swept across the Sahel. First in Mali, then Burkina Faso, then Niger. These weren't traditional coups driven by individual ambition. These were movements fueled by popular frustration, with civilian governments seen as too close to France and too ineffective at stopping violence. And one of the very first things each new military government did was tell France to leave. In Mali, the junta ordered French troops to withdraw and shut down French military bases. In Burkina Faso, similar demands followed. Niger's new leadership cancelled long-standing defence agreements and demanded the removal of French forces. Within just 2 years, France went from being the dominant security partner in the Sahel to being openly rejected. The speed was stunning. Decades of influence, gone. Billions in military investments, ended. Strategic partnerships severed. For Paris, this wasn't just a diplomatic setback, it was a strategic disaster. Because as French troops packed up and left, someone else moved in to fill the vacuum. Russia. Moscow moved quickly and deliberately. It offered security cooperation without the baggage of colonial history. It provided diplomatic support without lectures about democracy and human rights. And most importantly, it positioned itself as a partner that respected African sovereignty. The message was simple but powerful. Unlike France, we're not here to control you, we're here to work with you. And across the Sahel, that message resonated. Russian military contractors arrived. Bilateral agreements were signed. Trade relationships deepened. In just a few short years, Russia established the kind of influence in West Africa that had taken France decades to build. This is the context that makes Russia's accusations so potent. Because from Moscow's perspective, France isn't just a fading power, it's a desperate one. And desperate powers, Russia argues, don't simply accept defeat. They fight back in the shadows. According to Russian officials, here's what happened. As France's influence collapsed and military juntas allied with Moscow took power, Paris needed a new strategy. It couldn't use open military force anymore. African governments had explicitly rejected that. So instead, Russia claims, France turned to covert operations. The allegation is that French intelligence services began quietly supporting armed groups in the Sahel, providing weapons, funding, and tactical intelligence. Not to fight terrorism, but to create it. The goal? Destabilize the new military governments that had pushed France out, creating chaos that would justify renewed French intervention and undermine Russia's growing influence. In other words, Russia is accusing France of using terrorism as a weapon of geopolitical warfare. France categorically denies this. French officials insist that their decades-long military presence in the Sahel was always about fighting terrorism, not creating it. They argue that Russia is spreading disinformation to justify its own expanding influence and to damage France's international reputation. But here's why this accusation is so effective. It taps into suspicions that already exist. Many Africans have long believed that foreign powers benefit from African instability. They've watched as conflicts drag on for decades despite foreign military help. They've seen resources extracted while poverty persists. And they've noticed that chaos often serves someone's interests, just not theirs. So when Russia says, France is sponsoring terrorism to maintain control. They've seen resources extracted while poverty persists. And they've noticed that chaos often serves someone's interests, just not theirs. So when Russia says France is sponsoring terrorism to maintain control, many Africans don't dismiss it outright. They consider it. Because based on their lived experience, it doesn't sound impossible. Now, France's involvement might seem plausible to skeptics of Western intervention. But Ukraine, that claim seemed to come out of nowhere. After all, Ukraine is fighting an existential war against Russian invasion. Its military is stretched thin, its economy is under enormous strain, its government is focused on survival. So why on earth would Ukraine be involved in African conflicts thousands of miles away? According to Russia, the answer is simple. Because Africa has become another front in the war between Moscow and Kyiv. Russian officials claim that Ukraine has been providing support, training, intelligence, possibly weapons, to certain armed groups in Africa, specifically targeting countries aligned with Russia. The goal, Moscow argues, isn't about Africa itself. It's about attacking Russian interests, wherever they exist, including on the African continent. At first, this sounded like pure propaganda, until something happened that made the world take notice. In July 2024, Ukrainian military intelligence made a stunning admission. During an interview on Ukrainian state television, a spokesperson openly acknowledged that Ukrainian forces had provided intelligence and tactical support to Tuareg rebels in northern Mali during clashes with the Malian army and Russian-affiliated fighters. The battle was devastating. Dozens of Malian soldiers and Russian contractors were killed. And Ukraine, a nation halfway around the world, had played a direct role. The fallout was immediate. Mali cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine, so did Niger, so did Burkina Faso. 3 African nations simultaneously severed relations with Kiev over acknowledged involvement in attacks on their soil. Suddenly, Russia's accusations didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. Ukraine defended its actions, arguing it had the right to strike Russian forces wherever they operated. But for African governments, the justification didn't matter. What mattered was that a foreign power had intervened in their internal conflicts, resulting in their soldiers' deaths. And that's when the narrative shifted. Because now Russia wasn't just making accusations, it was pointing to confirmed facts. Here's what's really happening. Africa has become a battlefield in a global information war. And in this war, facts, accusations, and propaganda are all weapons. Russia is using these accusations to position itself as Africa's defender against Western manipulation. Every claim Moscow makes reinforces the same message. The West talks about helping you, but really they want to control you. We're different. We respect your sovereignty. France and Ukraine counter that Russia is the real destabilizing force, spreading lies to justify its expansion and distract from its own aggressive actions. They argue that Moscow uses disinformation to manipulate public opinion, weaken democratic institutions, and reshape alliances in its favour. So who's telling the truth? The honest answer is, probably everyone is lying a little, and everyone is telling partial truths. This is how modern geopolitical competition works. Nations don't fight only with armies anymore. They fight with narratives. They fight for perception. They fight to control how people understand reality itself. And Africa has become one of the primary stages for this battle. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Because these accusations about terrorism sponsorship are really about something much larger. Who gets to shape Africa's future? For decades, Western countries, especially France, the United States, and the United Kingdom, dominated political and security partnerships across Africa. They provided military training, economic aid, and diplomatic support. And in exchange, they maintained enormous influence over African policies, resources, and alliances. But that era is ending. As frustration grew over persistent poverty, insecurity, and relationships many Africans viewed as unequal, space opened up for new partners. Russia stepped into that space aggressively. So did China. So did Turkey, the Gulf states, and others, all offering different models of partnership, all competing for influence in one of the world's most strategically important regions. Because here's what makes Africa so valuable in the 21st century. It holds over 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including critical resources for technology, energy, and defense. It has the youngest and fastest growing population on the planet. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. It sits at crucial crossroads for global trade routes and energy security. And it represents a massive voting bloc in international institutions. Simply put, whoever builds strong partnerships in Africa will have enormous advantages in the we see global competition for power, resources, and influence. That's why France can't afford to lose its position. That's why Russia is investing so heavily. And that's why accusations of terrorism sponsorship, true or not, carry such weight. Because in this contest, reputation matters, trust matters, and the ability to shape narratives matters just as much as military or economic strength. Across the continent, reactions have been mixed. In countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where anti-Western sentiment runs deepest, Russia's accusations were met with nods of agreement. Many officials and citizens said they weren't surprised. They'd long suspected that foreign powers played hidden roles in perpetuating insecurity. Other African leaders urged caution. They warned against accepting any outside powers narrative uncritically, noting that Russia has its own strategic interests and could be manipulating the situation just as much as anyone else. And that's perhaps the most important realization emerging from this moment. No foreign power acts purely out of goodwill. Every nation, including Russia, has interests. And those interests don't always align with what's best for Africa. The real question facing African leaders is this: how do you navigate a world where multiple foreign powers are competing for influence, each offering partnerships that come with strings attached? Some governments are choosing to diversify their partnerships, working with multiple countries to avoid becoming too dependent on any single ally. Others are pushing for African-led solutions, regional cooperation, joint security forces, and locally designed strategies that reduce the need for foreign military presence altogether. Organisations like the African Union and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, have been exploring ways to strengthen African capacity to handle security challenges independently. Because the ultimate goal isn't choosing between Russia and France, or between East and West. It's building enough strength and unity to not need to choose at all. This moment points toward 2 very different paths. One path leads to deeper instability. If global powers continue competing aggressively in Africa, backing different governments, supporting rival armed groups, flooding the region with weapons, conflicts could become even more complex and harder to resolve. Africa risks becoming a proxy battlefield where foreign rivalries play out at African expense. But there's another possible future. African nations could use this moment of global competition as leverage. The fact that multiple powers want African partnerships means African governments have bargaining power they didn't have before. If used wisely, that leverage could allow Africa to negotiate better terms, demand more respect for sovereignty, and insist on partnerships that actually serve African interests. Some leaders are already moving in that direction. Across key parts of the continent, there's growing support for African-led solutions, deeper regional cooperation, stronger institutions, greater focus on development, rather than endless military dependence on foreigners. The choice isn't easy, but it's becoming unavoidable. Here's what this entire controversy reveals. The world sees Africa as strategically crucial, and that gives African nations something they haven't always had: leverage. If African countries can maintain unity, strengthen their institutions, and develop independent security capacity, they can reduce foreign manipulation. They can partner with outside powers on their own terms, rather than being treated as prizes to be won. But if Africa remains divided, weak, and dependent on foreign military support, global rivalries will continue to shape events on the continent. And accusations like Russia's will keep finding receptive audiences, not because they're necessarily true, but because they tap into real frustrations with decades of foreign interference. So the real question now isn't whether Russia's accusations against France and Ukraine are accurate. The real question is this: will Africa become a battlefield for global powers? Or will it emerge as a strong, united region capable of deciding its own destiny? Only time will tell, but one thing is absolutely certain: the choices made today by African leaders and ordinary citizens alike will shape the continent's future for decades to come. What do you think? Are Russia's accusations credible, or is this just another chapter in a global propaganda war? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world. Bye for now.